On what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Willowbrook, Missouri, Darius Coleman was simply updating his home network security. But when his paranoid neighbor Melanie Foster spotted him with electronic equipment, her racial bias triggered a 911 call that would expose a web of surveillance betrayal and criminal activity that no one saw coming. What the police discovered in this quiet suburban neighborhood will shock you to your core. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible true story, and don't forget to comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels around the world. The September sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Darius Coleman knelt beside his front porch, carefully examining the small black router in his hands. At 34, Darius had learned to be methodical about everything. His job as a network security analyst had taught him that details mattered, especially when it came to protecting digital privacy. What he didn't know was that across the street behind Venetian blinds, someone was watching his every move with growing suspicion. Melanie Foster pressed her face closer to the window, her manicured fingers gripping the blinds so tightly they left indentations in the plastic. At 52, Melanie considered herself the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator, though her version of community protection often crossed into territory that made her more observant neighbors uncomfortable. Today, something about the way Darius handled that electronic device set off alarm bells in her mind. "What is he doing over there?" she muttered to herself, reaching for her phone. The device in Darius's hands looked sophisticated. Technical, definitely not something a normal person would just casually handle on their front porch. And why was he being so secretive about it, constantly looking around as if checking to see if anyone was watching? Darius, completely unaware of the scrutiny, finished updating his router's firmware and began the process of changing his Wi-Fi password. It was something he did quarterly as part of his personal cybersecurity routine, a habit that had served him well in his profession. His neighbor's paranoid interpretation of this routine maintenance was about to turn his quiet afternoon into a nightmare. The first sign of trouble came in the form of sirens. Darius looked up from his laptop screen, where he'd been configuring the new network settings, to see two police cruisers turning onto Maple Street. He assumed they were headed somewhere else, maybe the Johnson house where domestic disputes were becoming increasingly common, or perhaps the Henderson place where teenagers had been caught vandalizing mailboxes last month. But the cars slowed as they approached his address, and Darius felt his stomach drop as both vehicles pulled into his driveway. Officers Martinez and Thompson emerged from their respective vehicles with the practiced caution of veterans who'd seen too many routine calls turn dangerous. Martinez, a 15-year veteran with graying temples, approached first, while Thompson, younger and more recently graduated from the academy, hung back near the vehicles. "Afternoon, sir," Martinez called out, his hand resting casually but visibly on his service weapon. "We received a call about suspicious electronic activity at this address. Mind if we ask what you're doing?" Darius slowly closed his laptop and stood, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of being a black man in America had taught him that even the most innocent situations could escalate if he wasn't careful. "Officer, I'm just updating my home Wi-Fi network. This is my house, I live here." "Can you show us some identification?" Thompson stepped forward, pulling out his notepad. "And what exactly are you doing with that equipment?" The question stung more than it should have. Darius reached slowly into his wallet, producing his driver's license. "This is a standard wireless router, and I'm changing the password for security purposes. I do this every few months as part of my job. I work in network security for Midwest Digital Solutions downtown." Martinez examined the license carefully, comparing the address to the house number behind them. "Mr. Coleman, we had a neighbor report that someone was tampering with electronic devices in a suspicious manner. They were concerned about potential illegal activity." "Illegal activity?" Darius's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. "Officer, I'm a cybersecurity professional. This is routine maintenance on my own network equipment on my own property." Across the street, Melanie watched the interaction unfold with a mixture of vindication and growing anxiety. She'd been right to call the police. Were taking this seriously. But something about the way the officers were handling the situation made her second-guess her initial assessment. Maybe she should go over and explain exactly what she'd seen. "Ma'am, please stay inside for now," Officer Thompson called out as he noticed Melanie stepping onto her porch. "We're handling the situation." But Melanie was already crossing the street, her phone still clutched in her hand. "Officers, I'm the one who called. I'm Melanie Foster. I live right there." She pointed to her house with a perfectly manicured finger. "I've been watching this activity for the past hour and something just didn't seem right." Darius turned to look at his neighbor, a woman he'd lived across from for 3 years, but had barely spoken to beyond polite waves. The expression on her face was one he recognized all too well, suspicion mixed with self-righteous certainty. "Mrs. Foster," Martinez said patiently, "can you describe exactly what you observed that concerned you?" He was out here with all sorts of electronic equipment, constantly looking around like he was trying to hide something. And he had wires and devices I've never seen before. In this neighborhood, we look out for each other, and this just seemed wrong. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Darius felt the familiar weight of being presumed guilty until proven innocent of having his every action interpreted through the lens of suspicion simply because of the color of his skin. "Mrs. Foster," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I've lived here for 3 years. I wave to you every morning when I leave for work. This is my house, and I'm performing routine maintenance on my internet equipment." "I don't know what you do for work," Melanie shot back her defensive tone, revealing that she realized how thin her complaint sounded. "All I know is what I saw, and it looked suspicious." Officer Martinez held up a hand. "Let's all take a step back here. Mr. Coleman, would you mind showing us this equipment you're working with, just so we can document what we found and close out the call?" Darius nodded, though internally he was furious at having to justify his existence on his own property. He walked over to where his laptop sat open on a small patio table, the router beside it connected by an Ethernet cable. "This is a standard Netgear router. You can see the model number right here. And this is my laptop, where I'm accessing the router's administrative panel to change the Wi-Fi password." Thompson leaned in to examine the equipment, his expression shifting from suspicion to embarrassment as he realized how mundane the situation actually was. "Sir, this does appear to be standard home networking equipment." "Because that's exactly what it is," Darius replied, unable to keep the frustration entirely out of his voice. "I'm a network security analyst. Part of my job involves understanding how these systems work, and part of protecting my own home involves maintaining good security practices." Martinez was beginning to piece together what had really happened here. A black man performing routine technical work on his own property had been reported as suspicious activity by a neighbor who clearly didn't know him well enough to give him the benefit of the doubt. It was a scenario he'd encountered too many times in his career. "Mrs. Foster," Martinez said, turning to address the woman who was now looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Is there anything specific about Mr. Coleman's behavior that suggested criminal activity? Any actual evidence of wrongdoing?" Melanie's face flushed as she realized how her call was being perceived. Well, no, not exactly. But in this climate, with all the cybercrime and identity theft, you can't be too careful. And he was being so secretive about it." Secretive. Darius's control finally slipped slightly. "I was sitting on my own front porch in broad daylight. How is that secretive?" The tension in the air was palpable. What had started as a routine police response was quickly revealing itself to be something much more uncomfortable, a manifestation of the racial suspicions that still plagued American neighborhoods, even in supposedly progressive communities like Willowbrook. But then something unexpected happened. As Officer Thompson was preparing to close his notepad and wrap up what was clearly a non-incident, Darius's laptop emitted a series of sharp beeps. The network monitoring software he ran as part of his security routine had detected something unusual. "What was that?" Martinez asked, his attention suddenly refocused. Darius frowned at his screen. "That's..." Strange. My network monitoring software is showing an unauthorized device connected to my Wi-Fi network. He clicked through several screens, his professional instincts overriding his frustration with the situation. This device has been connected for nearly 6 months. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What had been an embarrassing case of racial profiling was suddenly becoming something else entirely. What kind of device? Thompson asked, moving closer to look at the screen. I'm not sure yet, Darius replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he traced the connection. But it's been accessing my network regularly, and it's pulling a significant amount of data. This isn't just someone stealing Wi-Fi, this device is actively monitoring network traffic. Melanie Foster, who had been preparing to retreat to her house in embarrassment, found herself drawn back into the conversation. What does that mean? It means someone has been spying on my internet activity, Darius said grimly. And if they've compromised my router, they potentially have access to any device connected to my network. My computers, my security cameras, my smart TV, everything. Officer Martinez felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. In 15 years of police work, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about this situation was setting off alarm bells. Mr. Coleman, in your professional opinion, how serious is this? Very serious, Darius replied without hesitation. Whoever did this has been conducting surveillance on my home network for months. They have access to my personal data, my work files, potentially even live feeds from my security cameras. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. A black man had been reported for suspicious electronic activity, only for the investigation to reveal that he was actually the victim of electronic surveillance. Can you trace where this unauthorized access is coming from? Martinez asked. Darius was already working on it, running trace routes and analyzing connection logs. Give me a few minutes. The device is definitely local. It's connecting directly to my router, rather than coming in through the internet. As Darius worked, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Melanie Foster stood awkwardly to one side, clearly realizing that her racially motivated 911 call had inadvertently uncovered a real crime, but one where the man she'd suspected was actually the victim. Got it, Darius announced suddenly. The unauthorized device is connecting from... He paused, double-checking his results. It's connecting from 247 Maple Street. All eyes turned to Melanie Foster, whose face had gone pale. 247. Maple Street was her address. That's impossible, she stammered. I don't have any... the only people with access to my house are family members, and none of them would... Mrs. Foster, Martinez said carefully. Who else has access to your home? Any relatives? Roommates, people who might have installed devices without your knowledge. Melanie's mind raced. Her sister's son Brandon had been staying with her for the past 8 months, ever since he'd dropped out of college. He was good with computers, maybe too good. He spent most of his time in the basement room she'd converted for him, and she'd often heard him up at all hours claiming he was working on projects. My nephew, she said quietly. Brandon lives with me. He's very interested in technology. The pieces were starting to come together, and none of them painted a pretty picture. Officer Thompson was already calling for backup and a detective unit. What had started as a nuisance call about a black man changing his Wi-Fi password was rapidly becoming a criminal investigation into illegal surveillance. We're going to need to speak with your nephew, Martinez said. And we'll need to examine any electronic devices in your home that might be involved in this unauthorized network access. As they spoke, Darius continued monitoring his network, watching the unauthorized device's activity in real time. Officers, this device is currently active. It's accessing data right now. Specifically, it appears to be connected to my security camera system. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. Someone in Melanie Foster's house had been watching Darius through his own security cameras for months. The woman who had called the police because she thought her black neighbor looked suspicious had been harboring someone who was actually conducting illegal surveillance on that same neighbor. "Mrs. Foster," Martinez said, his tone now completely serious. "We need to go to your house right now." As the group began moving across the street toward the Foster residence, Darius packed up his equipment with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. 3 years of living in this neighborhood, 3 years of polite waves and brief conversations, and it turned out his biggest concern should have been about the quiet young man he'd occasionally seen coming and going from his neighbor's basement. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting longer shadows across Maple Street. What had started as routine network maintenance had become something much darker, and as they approached the Foster house, everyone involved had the distinct feeling that they were about to uncover something that would change this quiet neighborhood forever. Melanie fumbled with her keys at the front door, her hands shaking slightly as the weight of the situation settled on her. Behind her, 2 police officers and the man she'd wrongfully accused waited for answers. And somewhere inside her house, her nephew Brandon was about to face questions he'd never expected to answer. The door opened with a soft click, and they stepped into a home that looked perfectly normal from the outside, but was about to reveal secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for months. The real investigation was just beginning. The Foster house felt different the moment they stepped inside. Where Darius's home across the street radiated the organized efficiency of a tech professional, Melanie's living space carried an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the very air. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, but there was something forced about the smiles. Something that suggested relationships held together by obligation rather than genuine affection. "Brandon!" Melanie called out, her voice echoing through the hallway. "Brandon, can you come up here, please? We have some visitors." The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Martinez exchanged glances with his partner, both men instinctively positioning themselves to cover the exits. In their experience, when suspects didn't respond to initial calls, it usually meant they were either planning to run or destroying evidence. "He's probably wearing headphones," Melanie said quickly, though her voice betrayed her growing anxiety. "He spends most of his time in the basement working on his computer projects. Let me go get him." "Actually, Mrs. Foster, we'd prefer to accompany you," Thompson said firmly. "This is now part of an active investigation." As they moved through the house toward the basement stairs, Darius couldn't help but notice the small details that painted a picture of the Foster family dynamics. Empty beer cans on side tables, unopened mail stacked carelessly on the kitchen counter, and most tellingly, a series of increasingly frustrated sticky notes attached to the refrigerator. "Brandon, clean up after yourself. Brandon, pay me back for groceries. Brandon, we need to talk about your future." The basement stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into what had clearly become Brandon Foster's private domain. The contrast with the rest of the house was striking. Where upstairs felt neglected and tense, the basement was meticulously organized with the precision of someone who spent serious time and money on their setup. Multiple monitors glowed in the dim space, casting an eerie blue light across walls lined with expensive computer equipment. Hard drives hummed quietly in custom-built towers, and cables ran along the walls with the neat precision of a professional installation. This wasn't the setup of a casual computer enthusiast. This was the workspace of someone who took technology very seriously. "Jesus," Thompson whispered under his breath, taking in the sophisticated array of equipment. "This looks like mission control." But Brandon Foster was nowhere to be seen. "Brandon!" Melanie called again, louder this time. "Where are you?" A toilet flushed somewhere in the basement, and a door at the far end of the room opened. Brandon Foster emerged looking exactly like what central casting would order for a suspicious computer expert. 22 years old, pale from too much time indoors, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt that advertised a programming conference from 2 years ago. But it was his eyes that caught everyone's attention. They darted nervously between the unexpected visitors, calculating and assessing, in a way that immediately put the officers on alert. "What's going on?" Brandon asked. his voice carefully controlled, but with an underlying tremor that suggested he knew exactly why they were there. "Brandon, this is Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson," Melanie said, her motherly instincts kicking in despite the circumstances. "They need to ask you some questions about computer stuff, and this is Mr. Coleman from across the street." The mention of Darius's name caused a visible reaction in Brandon. His face flushed slightly, and his eyes flicked to the bank of monitors behind him, as if checking to make sure they were displaying innocuous content. "What kind of questions?" Brandon asked, stuffing his hands into his pockets in a gesture that Martinez recognized as someone trying to control nervous energy. "Son, we're investigating unauthorized access to your neighbor's computer network," Martinez said, watching Brandon's face carefully. "Someone has been connecting to Mr. Coleman's Wi-Fi from this address for approximately 6 months. The color drained from Brandon's face so quickly that for a moment Martinez thought the young man might faint. But instead of denying the accusation, Brandon's expression shifted to something that looked almost like relief. "Finally," he said quietly, causing everyone in the room to freeze. "Finally what?" Darius asked, stepping forward with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. Brandon looked directly at Darius for the first time since they'd entered the basement. "Finally, someone noticed. I was starting to think I wasn't as good at this as I thought I was." The admission hung in the air like a live wire. Melanie Foster's face cycled through emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of sick understanding as she began to grasp what her nephew was telling them. "Brandon, what are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I've been monitoring Mr. Coleman's network for 6 months," Brandon replied, his voice gaining confidence, as if the confession was liberating. "His Wi-Fi password was pathetically easy to crack, Secure Home 2024, and once I was in I had access to everything." Thompson was already reaching for his handcuffs, but Martinez held up a hand. There was more to this story, and he wanted to hear it before they made arrests. "Everything like what?" Darius asked, his professional curiosity overriding his personal outrage. Brandon gestured toward his computer setup. "Your security cameras, your file servers, your email, your browsing history, your streaming accounts. I've been watching you live your life in real time for half a year." The words hit Darius like a physical blow. The violation was complete and intimate in a way that made him feel sick. Someone had been watching him eat breakfast, work from home, video chat with his girlfriend, have private conversations with friends and family. Every moment of what he thought was private life had been observed and recorded. "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Brandon shrugged, a gesture that made his confession somehow more disturbing in its casualness. "At first it was just a challenge. Your network security was supposed to be professional grade, and I wanted to see if I could break it. But once I was in..." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It became fascinating, watching how someone really lives when they think no one is looking." Melanie Foster sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "Oh God, Brandon, what have you done?" But Officer Martinez was focused on something else Brandon had said. "You mentioned Mr. Coleman's network security was supposed to be professional grade. How did you know that?" For the first time since his confession began, Brandon looked genuinely uncomfortable. I did some research on him first. Found his LinkedIn profile, his company's website. I knew he worked in cybersecurity, which made it more of a challenge." "So this wasn't random," Thompson said, making notes. "You specifically targeted Mr. Coleman because of his profession." "Not exactly targeted," Brandon said defensively. "I was looking for challenging networks in the neighborhood, and his seemed like it would be the most interesting to crack." Darius felt a chill run down his spine. "How many other networks have you compromised?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Brandon answered. "In this neighborhood, just yours. But there have been others." "Others where?" Martinez demanded. "Different neighborhoods, different challenges." Brandon was speaking more freely now, seeming to enjoy having an audience for his technical accomplishments. The Johnson family over on Oak Street, they had some interesting financial data. The Patels on Riverside Drive were running a home business I was able to monitor. The college professor on Elm, who thought his academic research was secure. With each revelation, the scope of Brandon's criminal activity became clearer. This wasn't a one-time breach motivated by curiosity, it was a systematic pattern of illegal surveillance across multiple victims. "How many people have you been spying on?" Thompson asked. "Actively right now probably 15 or 20 households," Brandon said, as if discussing the weather. "But I've monitored dozens over the past couple of years." The basement fell silent, except for the humming of computers and the sound of Melanie Foster quietly sobbing. The magnitude of what they'd uncovered was staggering. Not just a single case of illegal access, but a widespread surveillance operation that had been running undetected for years. "Brandon, show them," Darius said suddenly, his voice hard with anger. "Show them what you've been watching." "I don't think that's—" Melanie started to protest. "Show them," Darius repeated, cutting her off. "I want to know exactly how much of my life this sick bastard has stolen." Brandon hesitated for a moment, then moved to one of his computers. A few keystrokes brought up a login screen, then a desktop filled with folders organized by address and date ranges. Darius's stomach turned as he saw his own address prominently displayed with subfolders labeled Security Cams, Email Access, Financial Data, and Personal Files. This folder structure suggests very organized long-term surveillance. Martinez observed grimly. "This isn't the work of a casual hacker. This is systematic criminal enterprise." Brandon clicked on the security camera folder, and suddenly multiple windows opened, showing live feeds from around Darius's property. His front porch, backyard, garage, and even interior rooms were displayed in real-time high-definition video. "You've been watching me inside my house." Darius's voice was barely controlled. "The cameras in your bedroom and bathroom I disabled?" Brandon said, as if this was some kind of ethical line he wouldn't cross. "But the living room, kitchen, home office? Yeah, I've seen everything." The casual way Brandon discussed his violations made everyone in the room uncomfortable. This wasn't someone who understood the seriousness of what he'd done. This was someone who viewed other people's privacy as his personal entertainment. "What about the other victims?" Martinez asked. "Are you actively monitoring them right now too?" Brandon nodded toward another computer. "Want to see?" Without waiting for an answer, he brought up another screen showing a grid of camera feeds from different houses. The Johnson family eating dinner. The Patels working in their home office. An elderly woman they didn't recognize watching television alone. "Turn it off," Thompson said sharply. "Turn all of it off right now." "But this is evidence," Brandon protested. "Don't you want to see what I've accomplished?" The word choice, accomplished, revealed everything about Brandon's mindset. He didn't see himself as a criminal who had violated dozens of people's privacy. He saw himself as a skilled technician who had successfully completed challenging projects. "What we want," Martinez said firmly, "is for you to shut down these illegal surveillance operations immediately. And then you're going to help us contact every single person you've victimized so they can secure their networks and assess what damage you've caused." For the first time, Brandon looked genuinely upset. "But it took me years to build all this. Do you know how much work went into cracking some of these networks? Do you know how many felonies you've committed?" Thompson shot back. "Computer trespass, illegal surveillance, identity theft, violation of privacy. We're looking at decades of prison time here." The mention of prison time finally seemed to break through Brandon's technical pride and force him to confront the reality of his situation. His face went pale again, and he looked around the basement that had been his kingdom with the expression of someone seeing it for the first time. "I never hurt anyone," he said weakly. "I was just watching." "Just watching," Darius exploded. You've been stealing my private moments for 6 months. You've seen me grieve when my father died. You've watched me argue with my girlfriend. You've observed me dealing with work stress and personal problems. How is that not hurting me?" The emotional weight of the violation was finally sinking in for everyone in the room. This wasn't just about computer crime, it was about the fundamental human right to privacy in one's own home. "And what about the financial data you mentioned?" Martinez asked. "Have you stolen any money or used anyone's personal information for fraud?" Brandon shook his head quickly. "No, nothing like that. I was only interested in watching, not stealing." "But you accessed financial data," Thompson pressed. "Bank accounts, credit cards, investment information." "Only to see if I could," Brandon insisted. "I never used any of it." Darius felt another wave of violation wash over him. "You've seen my bank statements, my credit card purchases, my investment portfolio. Just the data that was accessible through your home network," Brandon said, as if this was a meaningful distinction. "I wasn't doing anything malicious with it." "Invading someone's privacy is malicious," Melanie Foster said suddenly, speaking for the first time since the full scope of her nephew's activities had been revealed. "Brandon, how could you do this to innocent people? How could you do this to our neighbors?" Brandon turned to his aunt with genuine confusion. "I thought you'd be proud of my technical skills. You're always saying I need to apply myself and find something I'm good at." The statement revealed a level of social disconnection that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Brandon genuinely seemed to believe that illegal surveillance was a legitimate demonstration of technical competence. "Being good at something doesn't make it right," Martinez said. "And violating people's privacy isn't a job skill, it's a serious crime." As they continued talking, Darius found himself studying the computer setup with professional interest, despite his personal outrage. The sophistication of the operation was impressive from a technical standpoint, even as it was horrifying from a human one. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "The surveillance? About 3 years total," Brandon replied. "But I've been interested in network security since high school." 3 years of watching innocent families in their homes," Thompson said, making notes. 3 years of systematic privacy violations." "Did you record anything?" Martinez asked suddenly. "Do you have stored video files, saved emails, captured personal data?" The question caused Brandon to freeze, and everyone in the room realized they'd hit on something significant. "Brandon?" Melanie asked quietly. "What aren't you telling us?" For the first time since his confession began, Brandon looked genuinely frightened. I may have saved some files, for documentation purposes." "What kind of files?" Darius demanded. "Video clips of interesting conversations, screenshots of important emails, financial records that seem significant," Brandon admitted. "I kept detailed logs of everything I observed." The basement fell silent as the full implications of this revelation sank in. Not only had Brandon been conducting real-time surveillance, but he had been creating a permanent record of his victims' most private moments. "Show us," Martinez ordered. Brandon reluctantly navigated to another section of his computer system, revealing terabytes of stored data organized by victim and date. Video files, audio recordings, captured emails, financial documents, personal photos, years of stolen private moments reduced to digital files on a hard drive. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered. "This is like a stalker's trophy collection." The comparison hit everyone hard. What they were looking at wasn't just computer crime. It was the digital equivalent of someone hiding in their victims' closets, watching and recording their most intimate moments. "Brandon," Melanie said, her voice breaking, "you've been living in my house while conducting a systematic campaign of harassment against our neighbors. How could I not know? How could I not see what you were doing?" "Because I was careful," Brandon replied, seeming to take pride in his deception. "I only accessed networks during times when the activity would blend in with normal usage patterns. I used advanced encryption and routing techniques to hide my digital footprint. I was really good at staying invisible." But as Brandon spoke, Darius noticed something that made his blood run cold. On one of the monitors, partially hidden behind other windows, he could see what appeared to be a live video feed of a young girl's bedroom. "Whose room is that?" he asked sharply, pointing at the screen. Brandon followed his gaze and quickly minimized the window, but not before everyone had seen it. "Answer the question," Martinez demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Whose bedroom were you watching?" The atmosphere in the basement shifted dramatically. What had been a serious case of privacy violation was suddenly something much more sinister. "It's not what you think," Brandon said quickly, panic creeping into his voice for the first time. "Then explain what it is," Thompson said, stepping closer. "Right now." Brandon's confession was about to take a turn that would transform this investigation from a cybercrime case into something that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. Brandon's hands trembled as he reluctantly maximized the window that Darius had spotted. The feed showed a teenage girl's bedroom, but the angle was wrong, too low, too intimate. This wasn't footage from a standard home security camera. "That's Emma Patterson," Brandon said quietly. "She's 16, lives on Riverside Drive with her parents." Officer Martinez felt his stomach turn. In 15 years of police work, he'd seen enough predator cases to recognize the warning signs, and everything about this situation was setting off alarm bells. "How long have you been watching this girl?" "It's not like that," Brandon protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not some pervert. I was monitoring the family's network security, and this camera feed just happened to be accessible." "Happened to be accessible." Thompson's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Brandon, where is this camera located?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Brandon answered. It's a webcam on her laptop. I gained access when I compromised the family's network." Darius felt sick. What they were looking at wasn't just surveillance, it was potentially the systematic stalking of a minor. "You've been watching a 16-year-old girl in her bedroom without her knowledge." "I never saved any inappropriate footage," Brandon said desperately. "I was just monitoring to see what kind of data I could access from her device." Martinez was already pulling out his phone to call for additional units and specialized investigators. This case had just crossed from cybercrime into potential child exploitation, and they needed experts who dealt specifically with predatory behavior. "How many minors have you been watching?" Thompson demanded. Brandon's hesitation told them everything they needed to know before he even spoke. "There might be a few other families with teenagers whose networks I've accessed." Melanie Foster let out a sound that was part sob, part scream. "Brandon, tell me you didn't. Tell me you weren't." "I wasn't doing anything sexual," Brandon insisted. But his aunt's horrified expression suggested she was beginning to understand just how deep her nephew's violations went. "I was studying human behavior patterns. It was like a sociology experiment." "A sociology experiment?" Darius's voice was incredulous. "You were spying on children in their bedrooms and calling it research." The basement felt smaller and more claustrophobic with each revelation. What had started as a simple case of Wi-Fi theft had become something monstrous, and everyone in the room was grappling with the reality that they were standing in what amounted to a predator's surveillance center. "Show us all of them," Martinez ordered. "Every minor you've been monitoring, right now." Brandon's face had gone completely white, but he began navigating through his file system with shaking hands. Window after window opened, revealing camera feeds from various bedrooms, bathrooms, and private spaces. The victims were clearly young. Some appeared to be in their early teens. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered. "How many kids are we talking about?" "Maybe 8 or 10, Brandon admitted. "But I was only observing their digital behavior patterns. I never made contact with any of them. I never tried to meet them or—" "You were watching children in their private spaces without their knowledge or consent." Martinez cut him off. "That's criminal voyeurism at minimum, and depending on what you recorded, it could be much worse." As they spoke, One of the feeds showed a young girl changing clothes, and Thompson immediately reached over to shut off the monitor. "Turn all of this off right now. Every camera, every feed, everything." Brandon complied, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the room had seen enough to understand that they were dealing with something far more serious than simple cybercrime. This was systematic surveillance of minors conducted from the basement of a suburban home by someone who lived with his aunt and flew completely under the radar. "Brandon," Melanie said, her voice barely audible, "how long have you been watching children?" "About 18 months, he replied. "But it wasn't sexual. I was interested in studying social dynamics among teenagers, how they interact online, what their privacy expectations are, how they use technology." The rationalization made everyone in the room feel sick. Brandon was describing predatory behavior while genuinely seeming to believe that his supposed scientific interest made it acceptable. "Did you share any of this content with anyone else?" Martinez asked. "Post it online, send it to other people, trade it with other predators." The question seemed to genuinely surprise Brandon. "No, of course not. This was my private research project." "Research project?" Darius stepped closer, his professional background making him uniquely qualified to understand the technical aspects of what Brandon had been doing. "Show me your data collection methods. Show me how you were categorizing and analyzing this surveillance." Brandon hesitated, then opened another section of his computer system. What they saw was worse than anyone had imagined. Detailed spreadsheets tracked the daily routines of dozens of victims, including specific notes about the minors' behavior patterns, emotional states, and personal relationships. "You've been keeping psychological profiles on these children," Thompson said, his voice heavy with disgust. "I was documenting observable behavior patterns," Brandon replied defensively. "Understanding how digital natives interact with technology in their private spaces." Melanie Foster was openly weeping now, the full horror of what her nephew had been doing finally sinking in. "Brandon, these are real children, real families. What you've done to them, what you've stolen from them." "I never hurt anyone," Brandon repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "You violated their most basic right to privacy in their own homes," Darius said. "You turned their bedrooms into your personal surveillance laboratory. How is that not hurting them?" As they continued examining Brandon's data collection system, Martinez made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. "Brandon, what is this folder labeled Behavioral Escalation Studies?" Brandon's face went ashen. That's documentation of times when subjects exhibited unusual or interesting behavioral patterns." "What kind of unusual patterns?" Thompson demanded. "Emotional distress, family conflicts, intimate relationships," Brandon admitted. "Times when their behavior deviated from normal patterns in ways that might be psychologically significant." The implication was clear. Brandon had been specifically targeting and documenting his victims' most vulnerable moments. Arguments with parents, breakups with boyfriends, instances of teenage emotional crisis had all been observed, recorded, and analyzed like laboratory specimens. "You were hunting for these kids' worst moments," Martinez said. "You were waiting for them to be vulnerable so you could document their pain." "It wasn't like that," Brandon protested weakly, but everyone in the room could see that he was beginning to understand how his actions looked from the outside. "Then what was it like?" Melanie asked through her tears. "Explain to me how watching children in their bedrooms and documenting their emotional distress was anything other than predatory behavior." Before Brandon could answer, his computer system emitted a series of alerts. Multiple windows popped up showing error messages and connection failures. "What's happening?" Thompson asked. Brandon's face went from pale to panicked. "The systems are failing. Someone's cutting the connections." Darius moved to look at the screen, his cybersecurity expertise allowing him to interpret what was happening. "These aren't system failures. Someone else is accessing your network and shutting down your surveillance operations remotely." The room fell silent, except for the continuing alerts from Brandon's computers. Everyone stared at the screens as one by one the camera feeds went dark, and the connection logs showed external interference. "Who else knows about your operation?" Martinez demanded. "No one," Brandon said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've been careful to keep this completely secret." "Someone obviously knows," Thompson said grimly. "Someone with enough technical skill to penetrate your security and shut you down remotely." Darius watched the systematic dismantling of Brandon's surveillance network with professional fascination mixed with growing alarm. This isn't random interference. Whoever's doing this knows exactly what they're targeting. They're specifically shutting down your illegal surveillance while leaving your legitimate network functions intact. "Could it be law enforcement?" Melanie asked hopefully. "Maybe someone at the FBI or NSA who tracks this kind of activity." "Possible," Martinez replied, "but we didn't request any external assistance, and federal agencies typically coordinate with local law enforcement before taking action." As they watched, a new window opened on Brandon's computer, a simple text message that made everyone in the room freeze. "You're not the only one who's been watching." "What the hell does that mean?" Thompson asked. Brandon was staring at the message with an expression of growing terror. "I don't know. I don't understand what's happening." But Darius was beginning to piece together a terrifying possibility. "Brandon, in all your surveillance activities, did you ever notice other unauthorized devices on the networks you compromised? Other people who might have been conducting similar operations?" I never looked for that," Brandon admitted. "I was focused on the targets, not on other potential observers." "So while you were watching these families," Martinez said slowly, "someone else might have been watching you watch them." The implications of this possibility were staggering. If Brandon wasn't the only one conducting illegal surveillance in the neighborhood, if there was someone else with even more sophisticated capabilities, then every assumption they'd made about the scope of this case might be wrong. Another message appeared on Brandon's screen. "Check your own security cameras." "What security cameras?" Thompson asked. Brandon's face went white. I installed cameras around Aunt Melanie's house for security purposes, but they're not connected to the internet. They shouldn't be accessible remotely." "Show us," Martinez ordered. Brandon navigated to his home security system, and what they saw made everyone's blood run cold. The cameras around the Foster house had been accessed remotely, and whoever was controlling them had been systematically documenting everyone who came and went from the property, including detailed footage of police officers arriving and entering the house. "Someone's been watching us," Melanie whispered. "Someone's been monitoring my house while Brandon was monitoring everyone else's." But that wasn't the worst part. As they scrolled through the footage, they could see that the remote observer had been particularly interested in one specific visitor. A man in his 30s who had been coming to the house regularly for months, always at times when Melanie was at work and only Brandon was home. "Who is this person?" Martinez asked, pointing at the screen. Brandon stared at the footage with growing confusion and fear. "I don't know. I've never seen him before." "But he's been visiting your house regularly," Thompson observed. "According to these timestamps, he's been coming here 2 or 3 times a week for the past 4 months." "That's impossible," Brandon said. "I would have known if someone was coming to the house." But as they continued examining the footage, the truth became clear. The mysterious visitor had been coming during specific time windows, when Brandon was typically asleep or deeply focused on his computer work. Someone had been studying Brandon's patterns just as carefully as Brandon had been studying his victims. "This person knows your schedule," Darius realized. "They've been timing their visits to avoid detection." "But what were they doing in the house?" Melanie asked, her voice shaking. The answer came in the form of another remote message on Brandon's computer. "Check your basement storage room." Everyone turned to look at a small door at the far end of the basement that no one had paid attention to earlier. Melanie fumbled for the key, her hands shaking as she unlocked the door and switched on the light. What they found inside made everyone step back in shock. The storage room had been converted into a secondary surveillance center, even more sophisticated than Brandon's setup. Multiple servers hummed quietly in custom-built racks, and cables ran from the equipment through holes drilled in the walls. "Someone's been running their own operation from your house," Martinez said grimly. "While you were spying on your neighbors, someone else was using your home as a base for an even larger surveillance network." Brandon stared at the equipment in complete bewilderment. "I had no idea this was here. How is this possible?" "Because while you were focused on watching other people," Thompson replied, "you forgot to watch your own back." As they examined the secondary surveillance center, Darius made a discovery that sent chills down everyone's spine. The equipment in the storage room wasn't just monitoring local networks. It was connected to a vast online network that appeared to be coordinating surveillance operations across multiple states. "This isn't just local cybercrime," he said quietly. "This looks like part of a national surveillance network. Whoever set this up has been using your basement as a node in a much larger operation." The scope of what they'd uncovered was almost too large to comprehend. What had started as a simple complaint about suspicious activity had revealed not just one predator conducting illegal surveillance, but evidence of a sophisticated network that had been operating undetected for months or possibly years. "We need federal agents here immediately," Martinez said, pulling out his phone. "This is way beyond local jurisdiction." But before he could make the call, every computer in the basement suddenly shut down simultaneously. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness, except for the glow of emergency lighting. "Someone's cutting the power." Thompson said, his hand moving to his weapon. In the darkness, they could hear footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate steps that suggested someone was moving through the house above them. "Stay together," Martinez whispered. "We're going upstairs, and we're going now." As they moved toward the basement stairs, Melanie grabbed Darius's arm. "Mr. Coleman," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I called the police on you because I thought you looked suspicious, and all this time the real criminal was living in my basement." "We'll deal with that later," Darius replied quietly. "Right now, we need to focus on getting out of here safely." The footsteps upstairs had stopped, and the silence was somehow more ominous than the sound had been. Someone was in the house. Someone who knew they were trapped in the basement, and someone who had been orchestrating this entire situation from the shadows. As they reached the top of the basement stairs, Martinez slowly opened the door and peered into the hallway. The house was dark, but he could see a figure silhouetted against the front window, someone standing perfectly still, as if waiting for them to emerge. "Police!" Martinez called out. "Identify yourself." The figure didn't move or respond. Instead, every television in the house suddenly turned on simultaneously, displaying the same message. "Welcome to the real surveillance network. Brandon was just the beginning." The figure by the window turned slowly, and in the eerie glow of the television screens, they could see it was a woman in her 40s, with short auburn hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans, looking more like a suburban mother than a criminal mastermind. But there was something in her calm demeanor that was far more unsettling than any dramatic villain pose would have been. "Officer Martinez, Officer Thompson," she said in a voice that was disturbingly pleasant. "Mr. Coleman, Mrs. Foster, and of course Brandon." Her eyes lingered on each person as she spoke their name as if she knew them intimately. "I've been watching all of you for quite some time." Martinez kept his weapon drawn, but didn't advance. Something about the woman's complete lack of concern in the face of armed police officers suggested she had contingencies they couldn't see. "Identify yourself, now." "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she replied, reaching slowly into her purse. "I'm a behavioral psychologist, and I've been conducting a long-term study on digital privacy expectations and surveillance detection in suburban communities." She withdrew a leather wallet and tossed it gently toward Martinez, who caught it without taking his eyes off her. Inside was an identification card from the University of Illinois Department of Psychology, along with what appeared to be a federal research grant authorization. "You're telling us this was all a psychological experiment?" Thompson asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Not an experiment," Dr. Chen corrected. "A comprehensive field study on how individuals and law enforcement respond to the discovery of illegal surveillance networks. Brandon here has been an unwitting subject, and all of you have been participating in the observation phase." Darius felt his blood pressure spike. "You've been studying us like lab rats while this psychopath was violating children's privacy." "The children were never in any real danger," Dr. Chen said calmly. "Brandon's activities were monitored and controlled. Any footage involving minors was immediately deleted from his systems and replaced with harmless data. We've been documenting his behavioral patterns without allowing actual exploitation to occur." Brandon stared at her in complete confusion. "Who are you? How do you know about my surveillance operations?" "Because we've been watching you conduct them from the very beginning," Dr. Chen replied. "Every network you compromised, every family you observed, every piece of data you collected, we've been monitoring it all in real time." The revelation hit Brandon like a physical blow. "You've been spying on me while I was spying on other people." "Multi-level surveillance observation," Dr. Chen confirmed. "We needed to understand not just how you conducted illegal surveillance, but how your targets reacted when they discovered it, how law enforcement responded to the reports, and how the entire community dynamic shifted once the truth was revealed." Martinez felt like he was losing his grip on reality. "Are you telling me that every person in this room has been part of some kind of sick research project without their knowledge or consent? Informed consent would have contaminated the data," Dr. Chen said matter-of-factly. "We needed genuine reactions to genuine discoveries. Brandon's surveillance activities were real. The violations were real, and your responses have been completely authentic." Melanie Foster, who had been silent since Dr. Chen appeared, finally found her voice. "You used my nephew to violate our neighbor's privacy so you could study our reactions. You turned my home into some kind of laboratory." "Your home was the perfect observation point," Dr. Chen acknowledged. "Brandon's technical skills and social isolation made him an ideal subject for our surveillance behavior study, and your position as an anxious neighbor provided the perfect catalyst for discovery." Catalyst. Darius stepped forward, his anger overriding his caution. "You're talking about my 6 months of violated privacy like it was a chemical reaction in a test tube." "In many ways it was," Dr. Chen replied without any apparent awareness of how callous she sounded. "We needed to understand how digital natives respond to the discovery that their most private spaces have been compromised. Your reactions have provided invaluable data about psychological resilience in the face of intimate violations." Thompson was trying to process the implications of what they were hearing. "How many people have been part of this study without their knowledge?" "In this phase, approximately 47 households across 6 different suburban communities," Dr. Chen said. "We've been running similar surveillance discovery scenarios in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Missouri, Iowa, and Minnesota." The scope was staggering. Dr. Chen was describing a multi-state research operation that had deliberately orchestrated privacy violations and psychological trauma for dozens of families, all in the name of academic research. "This is insane," Martinez said. "You can't conduct psychological experiments on unwitting subjects. There are laws, ethical guidelines, review boards." "All of which have been properly observed," Dr. Chen replied, reaching into her purse again. This time she withdrew a thick folder of official-looking documents. "This research has been approved by the relevant institutional review boards and is funded by a joint grant from the National Science Foundation and the Department of Homeland Security." She handed the folder to Martinez, who began scanning the documents with growing disbelief. Everything appeared to be legitimate university letterhead federal agency seals, detailed research protocols, and legal authorizations. "The government is funding this?" Thompson asked. "Post-9/11 security research," Dr. Chen explained. "Understanding how Americans respond to surveillance threats is considered a matter of national security. Our research helps inform policy decisions about digital privacy rights and surveillance detection protocols. Darius felt like he was trapped in a nightmare where nothing made sense anymore. You're telling me that the federal government paid you to orchestrate the illegal surveillance of American families. We facilitated scenarios where existing surveillance vulnerabilities could be discovered and studied, Dr. Chen clarified. Brandon's criminal behavior was already developing independently. We simply provided him with opportunities to express those tendencies in controlled environments where the damage could be minimized and the responses could be documented. Controlled environments? Melanie's voice was shaking with rage. You turned my home into a surveillance laboratory and my nephew into your guinea pig. Brandon was already exhibiting voyeuristic and intrusive behaviors before we made contact with him, Dr. Chen said. Our intervention actually prevented him from escalating to more serious criminal activity by providing him with targets and methods that we could monitor and control. The casual way Dr. Chen discussed manipulating and controlling human behavior was perhaps more disturbing than Brandon's original crimes. At least Brandon had been acting out of personal compulsion. Dr. Chen was orchestrating human suffering with the detached efficiency of a scientist studying insects. How did you make contact with Brandon? Martinez asked, still trying to understand the mechanics of the operation. Online gaming communities, Dr. Chen replied. Brandon was active in several forums where individuals with surveillance interests congregate. We identified him as a promising subject and gradually introduced him to more sophisticated techniques and targets. Brandon stared at her with growing horror. You're the one who taught me how to crack WPA3 encryption? You're the reason I was able to access Mr. Coleman's network. Among other capabilities, Dr. Chen confirmed. We needed you to develop sufficient technical skills to conduct meaningful surveillance operations that would generate authentic discovery scenarios. You turned me into a criminal, Brandon said, his voice barely audible. You were already predisposed toward criminal behavior, Dr. Chen corrected. We simply provided you with the tools and opportunities to express those tendencies in ways that served our research purposes. Darius felt sick as the full implications became clear. You deliberately created the situation that led to my privacy being violated. You orchestrated months of illegal surveillance just to study how I would react when I discovered it. Your reactions have been particularly valuable, Dr. Chen said, consulting what appeared to be notes on her phone. As a cybersecurity professional, your response patterns provide important insights into how technically sophisticated individuals process surveillance discovery. I'm not a lab specimen, Darius said through gritted teeth. I'm a human being whose life you violated for your sick research project. All research involves some level of impact on subjects, Dr. Chen replied with academic detachment. The question is whether the knowledge gained justifies the temporary discomfort experienced by participants. Temporary discomfort. Melanie stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. You've destroyed my relationship with my nephew, violated my neighbor's trust, and turned my home into a criminal enterprise. How is any of that temporary? The psychological effects typically resolve within 18 to 24 months. Dr. Chen said, as if quoting from a research paper. Follow-up studies with previous subject groups show that most participants recover their normal privacy expectations and community relationships within 2 years. The clinical language she used to describe human trauma was more chilling than any threat could have been. Dr. Chen genuinely seemed to view the people around her as research subjects, rather than human beings with rights and feelings. What happens now? Thompson asked. Do we arrest Brandon for the surveillance crimes, or do we arrest you for orchestrating them? That's actually one of the variables we're studying, Dr. Chen replied. How do law enforcement agencies respond when they discover that criminal behavior has been facilitated by legitimate research operations? Your decisions here will provide valuable data about the intersection of academic freedom and criminal justice. Martinez felt like his head was going to explode. You're studying us right now. Even as we're discovering what you've done, you're treating our reactions as data points. The research doesn't end when the subjects become aware of their participation, Dr. Chen confirmed. In fact, some of our most valuable insights come from observing how individuals process the knowledge that they've been studied without their consent. This is unethical human experimentation, Darius said. This violates every principle of research ethics that's existed since the Nuremberg trials. Research ethics have evolved significantly since World War II, Dr. Chen replied. When national security interests are involved, different standards apply. The courts have consistently upheld the government's right to conduct necessary research even when individual privacy concerns are affected. She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. The legal landscape around government surveillance and research had shifted dramatically in the decades since 9/11, creating gray areas that people like Dr. Chen could exploit. How many other families are going through this right now? Melanie asked. How many other people are discovering that their lives have been manipulated for your research? Discovery events are scheduled throughout the next 18 months, Dr. Chen said. Each community reaches the revelation phase at different times, allowing us to study variables like seasonal effects, regional differences, and demographic variations in response patterns. You have 18 months of this planned, Thompson asked in disbelief. Phase 3 of the study continues through next fall, Dr. Chen confirmed. Phase 4, which involves long-term follow-up with subjects who've completed the discovery process, will run for an additional 3 years. The scope of the operation was almost incomprehensible. Dr. Chen was describing a multi-year, multi-state psychological experiment that treated American families as test subjects in a massive surveillance study. What about the children? Darius demanded. What about the minors who were being watched and recorded? No children were harmed, Dr. Chen said firmly. All feeds involving minors were monitored in real time by research assistants with mandatory reporting training. Any content that crossed legal or ethical boundaries was immediately intercepted and deleted. But Brandon didn't know that, Martinez pointed out. From his perspective, he was engaging in criminal voyeurism involving children. His intent to commit crimes was genuine, Dr. Chen acknowledged. That's what made his behavioral patterns authentic and valuable for research purposes. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles arriving outside. Through the front window, they could see multiple black SUVs pulling up to the house, followed by a van with government plates. Federal agents? Thompson asked. Research team extraction, Dr. Chen corrected. Phase 2 of the Willowbrook study is now complete. The subjects need to be debriefed and the equipment needs to be secured. Subjects? Melanie's voice was incredulous. We're not subjects. We're people whose lives you've destroyed. The distinction is less meaningful than you might think, Dr. Chen replied as the front door opened, and several people in dark suits entered the house. The lead agent was a tall woman with steel-gray hair who looked like she'd stepped out of a government recruitment poster. Dr. Chen, is the observation phase complete? All primary objectives have been achieved, Dr. Chen confirmed. Subject responses were within expected parameters, and we have comprehensive documentation of the discovery and reaction phases. What about law enforcement cooperation? The agent asked, looking at Martinez and Thompson. The officers have been professional and thorough, Dr. Chen replied. Their investigative procedures and response protocols have provided excellent data about police reaction to complex surveillance discoveries. Martinez felt like he was losing his mind. Are you people discussing us like we're not standing right here? The federal agent turned to address him directly. Officer Martinez, you and your partner have been participating in a classified research operation designed to improve national security protocols. Your cooperation has been invaluable. We didn't cooperate, Thompson said angrily. We were responding to what we thought was a legitimate criminal investigation. Which is exactly why your participation was so valuable, the agent replied. Authentic responses can only be obtained when subjects are unaware they're being studied. Stop calling us subjects, Darius said, stepping forward. We're American citizens who've been illegally surveilled and psychologically manipulated without our consent. Mr. Coleman, your privacy concerns are noted and will be addressed in the post-study compensation package, the agent said, producing a tablet and scrolling through what appeared to be prepared responses. All participants will receive financial compensation and ongoing psychological support services. You think money makes this okay? Melanie asked. You think you can pay us to forget that you turned our lives into a psychological experiment? The compensation package is substantial, the agent assured her, and all participants are required to sign non-disclosure agreements to protect the ongoing research operations in other communities. The mention of NDAs sent a chill through the room. Not only had these people violated their privacy and manipulated their lives, but now they were trying to silence them to protect similar operations targeting other innocent families. What if we refuse to sign? Darius asked. That would be inadvisable, the agent replied. The research involves classified national security protocols. Disclosure of operational details could result in federal prosecution under the Espionage Act. The threat was clear and terrifying. They were being told that if they spoke publicly about what had been done to them, they could face federal charges for revealing classified information. This is insane, Martinez said. You can't conduct illegal surveillance operations and then threaten the victims with prosecution if they complain about it. The surveillance operations were conducted under federal authority, the agent corrected. They weren't illegal, they were classified. There's a significant legal difference. As federal agents began moving through the house, documenting equipment and collecting evidence, Dr. Chen approached Brandon, who had been standing in stunned silence since the revelation that his entire criminal enterprise had been orchestrated and controlled. Brandon, your participation in this research has been exemplary, she said. Your technical skills and behavioral responses provided exactly the kind of authentic data we needed. You made me into a criminal, Brandon said, his voice hollow. You taught me how to violate people's privacy and then watched me do it. You had the predisposition, Dr. Chen replied. We simply provided you with a controlled outlet that allowed us to study surveillance behaviors while minimizing actual harm. Minimizing harm. Brandon looked around the room at the faces of people whose lives had been violated and manipulated. Look what you've done to these people. Look what you made me do to them. The harm was necessary to generate authentic response data, Dr. Chen said. Research sometimes requires difficult choices. You destroyed my life, Brandon said quietly. You destroyed all of our lives. You'll receive the same compensation and support services as the other participants, Dr. Chen assured him. Your cooperation has been invaluable to national security research. But Brandon wasn't listening anymore. The weight of what he'd been manipulated into doing, combined with the realization that his entire criminal enterprise had been orchestrated by federal researchers, was finally sinking in. He sank into a chair, staring at his hands as if seeing them clearly for the first time. What happens to the other communities? Darius asked the federal agent. The other families you're experimenting on. Ongoing operations are classified, the agent replied. But I can assure you that all research protocols are designed to minimize psychological harm while maximizing data collection efficiency. You're going to keep doing this to other people, Melanie said, her voice filled with horror. You're going to keep manipulating families and violating their privacy for your research. The research serves vital national security interests, the agent said. Understanding how Americans respond to surveillance threats helps protect the homeland. By traumatizing innocent families, Thompson asked, by generating data that informs policy decisions affecting millions of Americans, the agent corrected. Sometimes, individual sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. The conversation was interrupted by one of the technical agents who approached Dr. Chen with a tablet displaying what appeared to be data summaries. Doctor, we're seeing some anomalous response patterns in the Riverside community, the agent reported. The Patterson family discovery event triggered unexpected community-wide reactions. Dr. Chen frowned as she reviewed the data. What kind of reactions? Neighborhood watch formation, police petition drives, and coordinated network security upgrades, the agent replied. The community is organizing collective defensive responses rather than the individual isolation patterns we observed in previous studies. Interesting, Dr. Chen mused. That suggests our hypothesis about community cohesion variables may need revision. Even now, faced with the human cost of their research, the federal team was treating the suffering of real families as nothing more than data points that might require adjustments to their experimental methodology. You people are monsters, Darius said quietly. You've turned human suffering into a science project. We're researchers trying to understand how Americans respond to surveillance threats, Dr. Chen replied. The knowledge we're generating will help protect the country from real security threats. By becoming the threat ourselves, Martinez asked. By traumatizing the very people you claim to be protecting. Research requires difficult choices, Dr. Chen repeated. But the alternative, being unprepared for real surveillance threats from foreign actors, would be far worse. As the federal agents continued their work, the people whose lives had been manipulated and violated stood in the middle of the Foster living room, trying to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. They had been laboratory subjects in a massive psychological experiment, and now they were being told they had no choice but to remain silent about their victimization. The real horror wasn't just what had been done to them, it was the knowledge that similar operations were continuing in other communities, targeting other innocent families who had no idea their lives were being manipulated for research purposes, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But as the federal agents methodically dismantled Brandon's surveillance equipment, something unexpected happened. Darius's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. The federal agent monitoring communications immediately moved to intercept it, but Darius had already seen the caller ID display, Emma Patterson. "Don't answer that," the lead federal agent commanded, but Darius was already swiping to accept the call. "Mr. Coleman?" The voice on the other end was young, frightened and determined. "This is Emma Patterson from Riverside Drive. I know what's been happening to our families." The federal agents froze. Dr. Chen's face went pale as she realized that their carefully controlled experiment was spiraling beyond their parameters. "Emma, how did you get this number?" Darius asked, ignoring the federal agent who was frantically gesturing for him to end the call. "I've been monitoring the surveillance network for weeks," Emma replied, her 16-year-old voice carrying a confidence that surprised everyone in the room. "I'm not just some victim you can study. I'm a computer science student, and I've been tracking the data flows from the illegal cameras in my room." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her professional composure cracking for the first time. "That's impossible. Our monitoring systems would have detected any counter-surveillance activities." "Your monitoring systems are garbage." Emma's voice came through the phone speaker, which Darius had deliberately activated so everyone could hear. "I've been documenting everything for my senior project on digital privacy violations. And I've been in contact with other victims across multiple states." The federal agents looked at each other with growing alarm. Their classified research operation was being exposed by a high school student who had turned their own surveillance techniques against them. "Emma, how many other victims have you contacted?" Darius asked. 43 families across 6 states, Emma replied. "Turns out when you violate enough people's privacy, some of them start comparing notes. We've been building a comprehensive database of the federal surveillance research program." Martinez felt a surge of hope for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "What kind of database?" "Everything," Emma said with evident pride. "Dates, times, surveillance methods, federal agent identities, research protocols, funding sources, and most importantly, evidence of the psychological manipulation techniques being used on unwitting subjects." Dr. Chen was frantically whispering instructions to her technical team, but they were shaking their heads helplessly. Whatever Emma Patterson had done to protect her communications, it was beyond their ability to intercept or block. The research is classified, the lead federal agent said loudly, hoping Emma could hear her. Disclosure of this information constitutes a federal crime. Actually, it doesn't, Emma replied cheerfully. I've been working with attorneys from the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU. Turns out, when the government conducts illegal surveillance on American citizens, the classification doesn't protect them from exposure. The surveillance wasn't illegal, Dr. Chen insisted. It was conducted under proper federal authority. Dr. Sarah Chen, Employee ID SC7749, Department of Behavioral Analytics, University of Illinois. Emma said, reading from what sounded like prepared notes. Your federal authority comes from a classified interpretation of the Patriot Act that's never been tested in court, and according to the constitutional law experts we've consulted, it won't hold up to legal scrutiny. The fact that Emma knew Dr. Chen's employee ID number sent a chill through everyone in the room. This wasn't just a high school student who had discovered she was being watched. This was someone who had conducted serious counterintelligence research. How did you access that information? The federal agent demanded. Same way your research team accessed our private networks, Emma replied. Except I actually had legal justification documenting crimes being committed against me and my family. Thompson was starting to grin despite the surreal circumstances. Kid's got a point. If they can hack into people's networks for research, she can hack into their networks for evidence. Emma, what's your endgame here? Darius asked. What are you and the other victims planning to do? We're going public, Emma said simply. Tomorrow morning, simultaneously, across all 6 target states, 43 families will be holding press conferences to expose the federal surveillance research program. We have documentation evidence, victim testimonies, and legal representation. Dr. Chen looked like she was about to faint. You can't do this. The research serves vital national security interests. The research serves your career interests, Emma shot back. We've seen your publication list, Dr. Chen. You've been building your academic reputation by traumatizing American families and calling it science. The classification protects the research, the federal agent said, but her voice lacked conviction. The classification protects illegal government activity, Emma corrected. But we're not disclosing classified methods, we're exposing criminal violations of constitutional rights. There's a big legal difference. As the conversation continued, Melanie Foster was staring at her nephew with a mixture of pity and growing understanding. Brandon, did you know about any of this? Brandon looked up from the chair where he'd been sitting in stunned silence. I thought I was smart. I thought I was some kind of criminal mastermind who had figured out how to spy on people without getting caught. His voice was hollow with self-realization. But I was just another lab rat in their maze. You were a victim too, Darius said, surprising himself with the compassion in his voice. They manipulated you into thinking you were making your own choices. I still made those choices, Brandon replied. I still violated your privacy. I still watched children in their bedrooms. The fact that someone was manipulating me doesn't change what I did. But it does change the context, Martinez said. If Dr. Chen and her team were providing you with techniques and targets, if they were encouraging and facilitating your criminal behavior, then they bear responsibility for the harm you caused. Emma's voice came through the phone again. Brandon Foster, if you're listening, you should know that we have evidence of the psychological manipulation techniques used on you. The federal research team deliberately triggered and amplified your voyeuristic tendencies. You're as much a victim as the families you were manipulated into targeting. Brandon started crying. Not the desperate tears of someone caught in a crime, but the broken sobs of someone whose entire understanding of himself had been shattered. Emma, Darius said, what kind of legal action are you planning? Civil rights lawsuit against the federal agencies involved criminal complaints for illegal surveillance and psychological manipulation and congressional testimony about the abuse of national security authorities. Emma replied with the precision of someone who had thought this through carefully. We're also demanding a full investigation into how many other communities have been targeted. The compensation packages, the federal agent began, are admission of guilt. Emma cut her off. You don't offer to pay people unless you know you've done something wrong. Dr. Chen finally lost her professional composure completely. Do you have any idea how much damage you're about to cause? This research program represents years of work and millions of dollars in federal funding. The data we've collected is invaluable for national security. The damage we're causing? Emma's voice was incredulous. You've traumatized dozens of families, violated the privacy of children, turned people's homes into surveillance laboratories, and manipulated vulnerable individuals into committing crimes. And you're worried about damage to your research program. The research serves the greater good, Dr. Chen insisted. The research serves your ego, Emma shot back. You've convinced yourself that violating people's rights is acceptable because you're doing it for science, but you're not protecting America. You're becoming the threat that Americans need protection from. The federal agents were now in full crisis mode, making urgent phone calls and frantically typing on tablets. Whatever contingencies they had planned for their research operation being exposed, they clearly hadn't prepared for coordinated resistance from their victims. Emma, what do you need from us? Darius asked. Just tell the truth, Emma replied. When the reporters start calling tomorrow, tell them exactly what these people did to you. Don't let them hide behind classification or national security justifications. What about the NDAs they want us to sign? Melanie asked. Don't sign anything, Emma said firmly. The constitutional rights attorneys we're working with have already filed injunctions to prevent enforcement of any non-disclosure agreements related to this research program. The federal agent who had been making phone calls returned with an ashen face. Dr. Chen, we have a problem. Legal is saying the victims may have legitimate grounds for criminal complaints. If they can prove the surveillance was conducted without proper judicial oversight. All our authorizations were properly obtained, Dr. Chen said, but she sounded less certain than before. From secret courts using classified interpretations of the law. Emma's voice came through the phone. We've been researching the legal framework, Dr. Chen. Your authority comes from FISA court rulings that have never been subjected to public scrutiny or constitutional review. The FISA court system is legitimate, the federal agent protested. The FISA court system is designed for foreign intelligence surveillance, Emma corrected. Using it to authorize psychological experiments on American families is a perversion of its intended purpose. Thompson was shaking his head in amazement. This kid knows more about surveillance law than most federal agents. I've had good teachers, Emma replied. When you violate someone's privacy, you give them powerful motivation to understand their rights. Dr. Chen was now pacing frantically, her careful academic demeanor completely gone. You don't understand the complexity of national security research. Sometimes ethical corners have to be cut to protect the country. No, they don't, Darius said firmly. And the fact that you think they do is exactly why this research program needs to be shut down. Mr. Coleman is right, Emma added. Real national security research can be conducted ethically with informed consent and proper oversight. What you've been doing isn't research, it's systematic abuse disguised as science. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of more vehicles arriving outside. But these weren't federal agents through the window. They could see news vans from multiple television stations pulling up to the house. How did the media find out about this? The federal agent demanded. I may have sent a few press releases, Emma said with obvious satisfaction. The story breaks in 12 hours anyway, but I thought it would be helpful to have cameras rolling when the federal agents tried to cover up their illegal research program. Dr. Chen ran to the window and saw reporters setting up equipment on the front lawn. This is a disaster. The entire research program is compromised. Good, Martinez said. Maybe the next group of families won't have to go through what these people have endured. As reporters began approaching the house, the federal agents went into full damage control mode. They quickly gathered their equipment and documentation, clearly preparing to evacuate before they could be questioned by the media. "Dr. Chen, Agent Williams, we need to leave immediately," one of the technical agents said urgently. But before they could move toward the door, Emma's voice came through the phone one more time. "Dr. Chen, Agent Williams, you might want to know that we've documented your identities, your vehicle license plates, and your current location. Running away from reporters doesn't look good on the evening news." Through the front window, they could see that several news crews had positioned themselves to film anyone leaving the house. The federal team was effectively trapped by their own desire to avoid public exposure. "This is a classified operation," Agent Williams said desperately. "The media has no right to interfere with national security research." "The media has every right to report on government abuse of American citizens," Thompson replied. "And that's exactly what this is." Brandon stood up slowly from his chair, looking out at the news crews with an expression of grim determination. "I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to tell them everything I did and everything that was done to me." "Brandon, you don't have to do that," Melanie said gently. "Yes, I do," Brandon replied. "I let myself be manipulated into violating people's privacy. The least I can do is help expose the people who manipulated me." Darius looked at the young man who had spent months watching his most private moments and felt something he hadn't expected: respect. "That takes courage." "It's not courage," Brandon said quietly. "It's just finally doing the right thing." Dr. Chen made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "If you speak to the media, you'll be revealing classified information. You could face federal prosecution." "Let them prosecute," Brandon said. "I'd rather go to prison for telling the truth than live free knowing I helped cover up this abuse." As Brandon moved toward the front door, Agent Williams stepped in front of him. "I can't allow you to leave this house." "Are you placing him under arrest?" Martinez asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "This is a national security matter," Agent Williams replied. "This is a constitutional rights matter," Martinez corrected. "And unless you're placing him under arrest with specific charges, you can't detain him." The standoff lasted for several tense seconds before Agent Williams stepped aside. She knew that physically restraining someone to prevent them from speaking to the media would only make the story worse. Brandon walked to the front door, paused for a moment to gather his courage, then stepped outside into the glare of television lights and camera flashes. Within seconds, he was surrounded by reporters asking questions about the surveillance operation and the federal research program. Watching through the window, Darius felt a complex mixture of emotions. 6 months ago, he never could have imagined feeling sympathy for someone who had violated his privacy so completely. But seeing Brandon take responsibility for his actions while exposing the people who had manipulated him was unexpectedly moving. "Emma," Darius said into his phone. "Thank you for fighting back, for organizing the other victims, for not letting them silence us." "Thank you for answering your phone," Emma replied. "And Mr. Coleman. Tomorrow, when this story breaks nationwide, remember that you weren't just a victim. You were the catalyst that helped expose a program that was traumatizing families across the country." As Emma ended the call, Darius looked around the Foster living room at the faces of people whose lives had been forever changed by what they'd discovered. Melanie crying quietly as she watched her nephew confess to reporters. Martinez and Thompson grappling with the realization that they'd been unwitting participants in a federal research program. Dr. Chen and Agent Williams watching their carefully planned operation collapse in real time. Outside, Brandon was telling his story to the growing crowd of reporters, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. And across the country, 42 other families were preparing to tell similar stories, united in their determination to ensure that no other innocent Americans would be subjected to the psychological manipulation and privacy violations they had endured. The sun was setting over Maple Street, casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood, where this extraordinary day had begun with a simple Wi-Fi password change. But as darkness fell, the bright lights of the television crews illuminated a scene that would soon be broadcast across the nation, the moment when ordinary Americans refused to be silent about government abuse disguised as research. Dr. Chen's behavioral study was about to generate data she never intended to collect proof that when people discover they've been systematically violated and manipulated, they don't just get angry, they fight back. And sometimes when they fight back together, they win. The real experiment was just beginning, and this time the American people were in control of the variables.